Great. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Path to Net Zero and COP26 as part of London Climate Action Week. We're so glad you could join us today. My name is Alex Lilienfeld, and I am the Strategic Partnerships Associate at the Climate Registry. We're a nonprofit organization governed by North American jurisdictions. And for over 10 years, we've been designing and operating programs and developing tools and services that help diverse organizations build capacity in greenhouse gas management, reporting, and verification. Throughout our work in the climate community, it's become clear that this decade will need to be one of the most transformative for climate action, as global greenhouse gas emissions are still far too high to meet the Paris Agreement's more ambitious goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Different actors across sectors, regions, and economies can catalyze the critical transformations needed to accelerate progress towards a net zero economy. The positive feedback between these actors further raises ambition and increases momentum along every stage of the value chain. The challenge now is to make sure these ambitious pledges are translated into action, especially in consideration of the delay to COP26. So in light of all this, we're thrilled to be here with you all today to talk about how we can make a bigger impact together. First, we're going to hear from 3 insightful panelists to better understand what they are seeing and doing in their sector. And then we at the Climate Registry will do a brief presentation about the innovative project that we are working on to support global net zero efforts by tracking pledges and pathways in a centralized, transparent repository and supporting cross-sector collaboration. So before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping notes. This session will be recorded and the recording will be circulated to all registrants later today. Please note that you're all on mute, but there are a variety of ways for you to engage with us during this session. You can access the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'd really like to encourage you to use the Q&A box also at the bottom of your screen. We will be addressing your questions after we hear from our panelists, but you're encouraged to submit questions at any time. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists today. Welcome to Sam Baker, partner at Deloitte, who has been with the organization as a strategy consultant since 1998 and is focused on corporate purpose and strategy, the SDGs and climate change, and impact definition and reporting. Thank you, Sam, for joining us from London. Maria Paolo Chiesi, Shared Value and Sustainability Director of Chiesi Group, whose objective is to constantly and rigorously measure and quantify the company's impacts on society and the environment, joining us from Italy. Miguel Naranjo, Program Officer and Carbon Neutral Now Lead at the UNFCCC Secretariat, whose focus is in capacity building for mitigation and carbon market mechanisms, promotion of voluntary climate action among the private sector, and development of tools for implementing climate action. And thank you, Miguel, for joining us from Germany. And lastly, our very own Amy Holm, the Executive Director of the Climate Registry. She is going to be the moderator for this conversation. So I will turn it over to you, Amy.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate it. And Sam, Maria, and Miguel, thank you for joining us today. Look forward to a lively discussion here. I'd like to start off first with a question for each of you to get the ball rolling. So maybe, Maria, I'll start with you with this first question. So I wanted to ask you, in the light of COP26 postponement, what are ways we can foster collaboration in the era of COVID and scale our efforts across sectors, given that we need to really accelerate action and ambition leading up to COP next year in November 2021?
Thank you, Amy. Well, the decision to postpone COP26 and above all the COVID pandemic crisis can be seen as a trigger rather than an obstacle to set higher climate ambitions. Well, first, at psychological level, everybody is now rethinking their relationship with the environment and see more clearly that we are all interdependent and that our planet is only one. And that the climate crisis can become the next emergency after COVID pandemic. And this is becoming every day clearer to all of us, including politicians and decision makers. And secondly, at governmental levels, Europe's latest decision to reduce emissions by 55% before 2030, and even more importantly, the proposal of the EU Parliament to devote to climate-friendly projects more than 40% of the next generation EU public investment are very important steps. Biden's election will also probably lead to US jumping on board again in the Paris Agreement, hopefully. So to make it short, I think that COP26 in Glasgow in 21 can turn out to be an event probably with a much more positive climate than would have been Glasgow 2020. And I think this is very important.
Thank you, Maria. Sam, what do you think about what we can do, given we've got another year to really focus our attention on actions and ambitions before COP26?
Yeah, so love Maria's optimism. Thank you for that. That's made me feel really good. I think that yes, there is a lot of emphasis at the moment on targets and ambition. I think that's a strong emphasis. That's an important emphasis. But you mentioned action, and we shouldn't forget action, and action now, action here and now, in the the race to set a great big target. Very often those targets are multi-decade. There's a huge amount being done at the moment, but we need to share that, and we need to learn from each other. And I think that having that sort of bifocal sort of lenses of both the targets and commitments and the ambitions, but also on the ground, what are we doing now? Can we demonstrate the impact we're having? I think we have an opportunity to sort of reinforce collaboration by playing between the two.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. And Miguel, you work for the UNFCCC, and so what does this kind of extra year mean to that organization and the work to be done, and the work that the UNFCCC is doing in order to put on this event next year?
Thanks. So maybe one of the immediate impacts is our colleagues working in the travel unit have had a lot of free time on their hands. No, just kidding. They are supporting other activities. No, I think about the COP26, it has given probably our hosts or future hosts, the UK government and the outgoing presidency, which is Chile, time to prepare better for the COP and also explore a new type of COP. The previous events were or have been growing significantly in number of participants, and you have the negotiations at the core, but so many other things going on around them. And these will probably not be possible for COP26, although we hope that the situation on the COVID-19 will be better, much better. Most probably we will not want to have the same size or the same amount of in-person events that were held in previous COPs. Of course, this is again decision by the UK to be made, but that's what seems more likely right now. So it's also an opportunity to try to do a new type of COP, right, where the virtual participation becomes more the norm, probably more a real tool that we implement, not as in addition to everything that we do in person, but as a key part of how the COP is delivered. For negotiations, you need a face-to-face interaction, so you will need to bring together the negotiators. But for everything else around that, there is a good opportunity to do things differently. So the postponement is a lot about thinking about reinventing. It's about more time to prepare. And also, I agree with Maria Paola that said that a lot of new commitments are coming up, a lot of new announcements, and therefore the postponement is also helping in that way. We will have much more, and hopefully it will continue like that, much more good news to give good momentum to the negotiations.
Mm-hmm. And Miguel, can you tell us how these net zero efforts that are happening will be incorporated into the official negotiations, and if there are side events at COP26?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the net zero, our goal, is part of COP26 since time zero, right? Since the beginning, because it's included in the Paris Agreement itself, in the preamble to the agreement, where it says that we need to achieve a balance between emissions and sinks. That's basically net zero. So of course, COP26 is all about the Paris Agreement, therefore it's all about net zero as well. But I understand your question. Your question is more on the explicitly net zero concept, right? So on the one hand, I think on the negotiation side, net zero is the final goal for everyone sitting there. So a lot of the conversation is going to be around how suitable the current NDCs and the processes that we have in place, the plans that have been announced, etc., are to get there by 2050 or earlier. This is, of course, part of the regular process of the Paris Agreement, where you will have regular checks of where we are, where our pledges are expected to take us, and trying to increase ambition from there. But net zero will become more and more important, the concept, in driving those discussions and those revisions. And in terms of side events, again, decisions about the COP are still ongoing, and it's our hosts, the UK, that will decide. But I cannot think about the COP without side events, either in person or virtual. So most likely we will have, and for sure you will have side events on this topic. On the one hand, you have Race to Zero, which is led by the Global Climate Action Champions, currently from Chile and the UK. So definitely there will be events around Race to Zero and other associated initiatives, yes.
Super. And so speaking of Race to Zero, I'm interested to know if there's any really exciting initiatives that you're seeing from that effort.
So yeah, the race has been adding new initiatives and new networks continuously since it was announced some months ago, which is great. I mean, the interest in Race to Zero has been very, very big. And the number that you see right now, if you go to the Race to Zero webpage and see who is participating, that doesn't reflect the number of submissions that have been received because many have not yet been approved. The reason being there is a set of minimum criteria that you need to meet. You need to set the target to be net zero by 2050 or earlier. You need to set a plan on how to get there. So the statement of intention is not enough, but also tell us some credible plan to get there. And then you need to implement and report regularly. So some of the initiatives that want to be part of it don't meet all of those criteria yet, and we are encouraging them to redefine, to move up the bar so that they align. But anyway, the interest has been enormous. And I think it would be unfair if I tell you, oh, I'm very excited about A, B, or C, because you have so many different ones. You have some that deal with whole sectors, right? Transport or construction, buildings, others that have to do more with individuals even. And all of them are very important at their own level, right? And we need everyone on board and everyone aligned if we are going to be successful, like Sam was saying, the cooperation. Without cooperation, we're not getting anywhere. So it's very interesting to see. I mean, the most interesting thing to see for me is the alignment between all of these radically different sectors for the first time, right? All aligning with this general criteria to be part of the race, even if they're coming from completely different areas and they have in their planning completely different probably priorities and specific actions to implement, and they start to see how they connect with each other. Yeah.
And so something to really keep an eye on this next year as that initiative continues to expand and grow. Sam, I wanted to turn it over to you at this point and ask you about the initiative that you've been working on, the Global 13 Impact Platform, and some of the most important findings that have come out of that initiative thus far, with respect to the actions needed and some of the barriers to delivering on the Paris Agreement. Can you speak to that, Sam?
Sure, Amy, thank you. And Maria and Miguel, please sort of interject as I go. But so the Goal 13 Impact Platform, Goal 13 after the SDG, was created about 8 months ago. It was created by CBI here in the UK, together with Accounting for Sustainability, together with Chapter Zero, with the Met Office, with Deloitte, and with Dell. So we sort of those were the founding partners. The intent was to build, or is to build, a repository of specifically of climate action, what people are actually doing at the moment, to do that on an attributed basis, so we can actually see who's doing what, everybody can see who's doing what. And the idea there is to stimulate the learning between organizations, to stimulate collaboration that we've already touched on a couple of times, and then even perhaps to begin to think about collective action, so people working together on joint initiatives. Not that we do that on the platform, but we can hand that off to one of the many initiatives, Miguel, that you've already touched on. So in terms of progress, we're very grateful of an extra year, by the way, because we were focusing on COP26. So we're grateful for the extra year. But basically, it's early stages, but we've reached out to about 800 organizations now. We've probably had about 25% of people keen to engage with us, and that means providing us with a sort of a synopsis, both of the context, including sort of targets and commitments, but particularly drilling into their actions and the impact that those actions are having at the moment. It's largely UK based at the moment. We've built out our platform, and we can demonstrate that at the moment. We're not sharing that yet, it's still under development, but we can actually demonstrate it. And then clearly we are trying to, as you said, Amy, it is global. And so we are working with up to 14 other countries at the moment, beginning to get the ball rolling in those countries as well. And clearly the value here, if we can get a high volume of really insightful, impactful stories about climate action, cross-sector size, cross-location, it becomes very powerful. So that's the dream and the hope. Mm-hmm. Just in terms of sort of the initial things coming out, so we did create an emerging findings report in September for a CBI conference, and we did that to try and demonstrate or show the type of information we're capturing. And just in sort of terms of the chunks, and just very, very quickly through those chunks, the first chunk of questioning is around ambition. So what are you actually trying to achieve? Clearly there is trying to make a sort of a loop back into the race to zero for COP26. So what are you trying to achieve? Generally, good news on what are you trying to achieve. People are upgrading their targets, thinking very hard about the specificity of those targets. That's all good. Perhaps slightly less good is the consistency of the way those targets are defined, and particularly when it gets to scope 3. So we'll all be familiar with that, and there is obviously movement on that dimension. The second thing we ask about is how do you organize against the ambition that you've got? And we've got a little taxonomy, which is sort of anything from a sort of overlay. So, you've accepted the challenge, but this is still an overlay, typically run by a small team, probably sustainability. You might have CEO sort of oversight, but you don't really have the business engaged, all the way to the other end of maturity, where it's at the heart of the business model, at the heart of strategy. So we probably, using that sort of taxonomy, asking a few questions, we've probably got to the stage where we think probably 2/3 of organizations are still relatively immature, but everybody's moving in the right direction, but it's still relatively immature. In terms of the drivers, so we typically ask this question through the lens of the stakeholders. Fascinating to see, that pressure that the organizations feel they're under. So where is that pressure to change? And of course, it's not homogenous. It depends on sector. But one of the key things was very interesting was actually the market and customers. That came through as the number top driver. So people see whether it's B2C or B2B, they see the market moving, and they see that they need to react to that. A close sort of second after that was the supply chain. Supply chain came a little bit further down actually. And one of the reasons it came further down was the complexities of driving the of getting the. Okay, one step back. Sorry, in terms of drivers, yeah, the first one was unexpected, being the market. But then we had two further ones, employees. So if you're a service organization like Deloitte, clearly employees are very, very important. And then investors, I was expecting to hear this much higher up the hierarchy, but actually investors was a little bit lower. And I think people are seeing lots of questions, lots of challenge from the investors, but they're not necessarily seeing that as sort of sparking or driving change if they're in the investment community, and therefore change from the company. So the driver piece is sort of very interesting as well. And then we get down to the initiatives, and I was jumping the gun a bit on the initiatives. So the initiatives is the heart of it. And what we've done is categorize. We ask for sort of 2 to 4 most impactful initiatives that are being carried out at the moment against climate change. That might be emissions, it might be resilience. And then we drill into that to try and understand, the impact, the activities, who's involved, etc. And we've got a number of different ways of classifying and codifying that. And just at the highest level, an obvious way to codify it is sort of operations, supply chain, or customers. Notwithstanding the driver being market, most of the initiatives still are within the operational boundaries. It's easier to do. There's a focus on efficiency. There's a focus on switching energy sources out, etc. And so most of the initiatives are still in the operational bit. Second is the customer piece, and that might be customer engagement, trying to educate the customer, or it might be actually products or services. And then the third is the supply chain, where I was getting to, which is still seen as complex. So notwithstanding the need to report against, scope 3, etc., it is seen as challenging, and that comes further down the list. We round off the interviews really by just then talking about the barriers and the learnings. The major barrier, not surprising to any of us really, is the need or the desire to see clear policy. So people, whether that's within their sector or cross-sector, people want to see the clarity of that policy in order to be able to then invest and change their business model against it. And we can see some of the recent announcements from the UK government, transformative to the sectors that they're touching upon. And I think it's inconceivable that you'd see the sectors reacting with the same rapidity and momentum if there weren't those policy announcements. So I think clarity of policy is one barrier. People are really looking for that hard. Internally, it's sort of paired with that organizational point. It's sometimes just a little bit challenging to get the business lines of business, the P&L leads, to really embrace this. They don't necessarily see the alignment, and so that's something we've all got to work with, sort of aligning that and explaining the business case. And then in terms of lessons, pleased to say, sort of bringing it back to the beginning of the conversation, the collaboration point comes through strongly. So in terms of learnings, it's collaborate. I mean, there are lots of other pieces as well. People talk about capabilities, they talk about the need for data, etc. But the collaboration piece comes out loudly and strongly. So that gives us heart as we continue to prosecute this initiative and drive scale.
Wonderful. Miguel or Maria, did either of you want to weigh in or have any comments?
Maria, go ahead. I thought you were making the move.
I think the point on policies is absolutely critical for companies. We need to have clear policies. I just make an example. We committed to carbon neutrality. We are using a standard that is a UK standard and also a certification that is a UK certification. So it's not Italian, it's not European, yeah, not anymore, unfortunately. We need standards, we need policies that are universal. Otherwise, companies will have difficulties in understanding, also in remaining competitive. So I think policies are very important. Otherwise, the investment really to learn, to understand is too high, especially for small companies.
Same from my side, just to add, Amy, that, well, delighted to hear about the collaboration bit, and that I think we have understood from our side from the beginnings, and it's nice to see that it's becoming more common, especially when you're talking about scope 3 emissions, right? Sam, when you go to scope 3, how are you going to address those? They are not directly under your control. The only way to do it is through collaboration, right? Encouraging others along your supply chain or all your value chain to also take action on climate, and so encouraging them, supporting them if possible in changing, so that then that is reflected also in your scope 3. So. And this is just one example of where collaboration is needed, not to mention many others. But in terms of policy, also just to say that the Paris Agreement is part of this, right? The importance of the Paris Agreement is not probably that it tells you exactly what needs to be done to save the world from climate change, because it doesn't. But it tells you all governments in the world have agreed that this is a priority, that and we need to stay below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5. And this gives clarity to everyone that all governments in the world, in principle, have agreed to that. Without that clarity, if COP21 in 2015 had resulted in no agreement, it would have delayed the momentum on climate action, I think, significantly. So it's the great thing about the Paris Agreement is that it gives you at least this very clear indication from national level government that this is where we want to go.
Thank you, Miguel. And Maria, turning back to you, CIESI has recently announced its commitment to become carbon neutral by 2035. Can you tell us a little bit about CIESI's current actions and future plans to achieve carbon neutrality by the state?
Yeah. So just for sake of clarity, CIESI is a pharmaceutical company. It's a multinational with 2 billion turnover and 6,000 employees in 29 countries all over the world. So we committed to become carbon neutral, to achieve carbon neutrality within 2035. And with the help of experts in this field, such as Equilibria and Anthesis, so really we needed consultants. We are rolling out the plan, which foresees as a first step to make a precise inventory of our emissions, not only scope 1 and 2, but also scope 3, which is a very significant undertaking. We envisage to complete the inventory in 1 month from now, and we plan to submit our reduction targets to science-based target initiatives during the first quarter of 2021. And this will allow us to fully disclose our emissions to the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, around the end of next year. So our main strategies to achieve net zero are the usual ones. So energy efficiency, process optimization, fossil fuels substitution, and energy from renewable sources, including self-production. A number of activities are ongoing to achieve our net zero objective, including car fleet electrification and reduction of flight traveling well before the pandemic. Code of conduct for our suppliers, including not only social articles, but also environmental considerations on the SDGs number 13. A purchase policy that favors green energy from certified renewable sources, LEED certification for all our buildings, and of course, reduction of energy consumption. But the main program, the most challenging program we have ongoing is the development of carbon minimal inhaler for patients affected by asthma and obstructive pulmonary diseases. As I said, we are a pharmaceutical company. So you know maybe the inhalers, the puffs. Currently, these inhalers contain a propellant which has a very high global warming potential. Even if considering the total emissions, so the emission linked to this propellant are negligible, but still they represent 90% of our emissions, scope 3. And so we have committed to a 5-year, 350 million investment plan, million euros, becoming the first pharmaceutical company leading the way towards carbon minimal inhalers that will preserve patients' choice and well-being by reducing the carbon footprint of our product by 90%.
That's very impressive. I'm interested to know, are you, is CIESI purchasing offsets as part of the carbon neutrality pathway?
According to the SBTi, offsetting should be limited to really negligible quantity. So we know that, for example, for the LEED certification of our building, the new headquarters we have just finished, we had to offset a very minimal part of the heat energy that we acquire from the municipality. There was no other way of eliminating that. So we had to offset that. But we tried to, according to the PAS 2060, that is the protocol that we use, try to avoid using offsetting to reach neutrality. So the vast majority will be reduction or substitution rather than offsetting.
And
May I ask a question, Amy, also, if I jump in?
Of course, please go ahead.
Thanks. I was just going to ask the same as you about the carbon neutrality. And then the question that I had is, are you defining carbon or climate neutrality in the same way as net zero or not? Because currently there is a discussion, right? What is net zero, what is carbon or climate neutral at organization level, right? At global level, it's clear, it's the same. Or basically the same, but organization level, there are different definitions. So I'm just wondering how you're defining.
Yeah, I've seen these different names. We used to say that our program is carbon neutrality because that was very clear to us. We were wondering nowadays if we have to change the name because everybody says net zero. And so we want to make sure that people understand what we say when we say carbon neutral. We are not sure that people still understand what carbon neutral means, but to us, it's absolutely the same thing.
Just to say, I don't want to deviate your conversation, Amy. So stop me.
No, please go ahead if you have something to, did you want to respond to Maria?
Yes, no, just to say that I think the consensus that is coming right now, or that is emerging right now, is that when you say I'm going to be carbon neutral or GHG neutral or something like this, it means that you are trying to avoid, reduce emissions as much as possible, and whatever you were not able to avoid or reduce, then in accordance to past 2060 or other standards that may come up, for example, ISO is working on a carbon neutrality standard now, then you offset, right? You offset with any type of credible, robust, certified offsets. And net zero, on the other hand, may mean actually that you are reducing and avoiding, just as in the other case, but when you come to offsetting, you do it only with long-term carbon capture. See, so technologies that allow for long-term capture of CO2, not reduction or avoidance or biosequestration offsets. And that's the real net zero definition, where whatever you emit, you're also helping capture from the atmosphere. So you're truly net zero. But this is, again, this is just the discussion that is ongoing, right? It's not written as an official definition yet.
If I may say, we are so much still concerned with the reduction that we haven't given a lot of thinking to the offsetting for the time being.
Reduction comes first. Yeah. Sorry, Amy.
Absolutely. And Maria, from your description of your actions that you're taking as a company to get to carbon neutrality, it involves working with a lot of other companies. And so how's that going? Are they embracing what you're trying to do? Do you have any other lessons learned in terms of working in this area through your supply chain and your vendors and to achieve your goals?
Yeah, the supply chain so far has been very collaborative, but I have to say that we are not, for the time being, asking to our suppliers to set up a target in terms of carbon neutrality or net zero. Mm-hmm. This could be the second step, okay? And this is because 90% of our scope 3 emissions are in the hands of the patients, not in the supplier chain. So this is different from the other kind of industries. For the pharmaceutical industry, collaboration is very important because this is a highly regulated sector. So we really need to work together as an industry so that we are not left behind in the COP26. Because the problem in the pharmaceutical industry is that the lead time, so the time needed to change a product are very, very high. So it takes 15 years to develop a pharmaceutical product. And then you have to register to the regulatory authorities of all the countries. So to make a change as the one we are doing, for example, not only it is very expensive, but it takes a lot of time. So it's very important that the policies in this sector are co-defined by all the stakeholders, including the patients' associations, for example, or the scientific societies.
That does make a lot of sense, Maria. And I can't believe we're getting to the end of our time here. It's gone by so fast. But I did want to take the opportunity to do a quick lightning round, about a minute for each of you, to talk about any challenges or opportunities for getting to carbon neutrality, and what gives you hope for the future. So Maria, we'll start with you.
Okay, so what gives me hope for the future is definitely the European Green Deal. Absolutely. This gives me a lot of hope. I'm really looking forward for all the strategies and the laws that will come out of that. It had already probably an influence on the other countries that in the recent days announced carbon neutrality target. But I think we really need to from the corporate side. I think we need to have compulsory targets for carbon emission reduction. Maybe it's strange to hear this from an entrepreneur, but if this is not compulsory, people won't do it until they see that it is absolutely necessary, or that it's cheaper than doing something else. So if we don't want to take that long to achieve that stage, we need to make it compulsory.
Sam, your thoughts?
Yeah, so sort of two reasons for optimism. I think one is, I'm relatively new to climate change, and I think even 2 years ago, the extent to which society adopted this as a primary issue was very different from today. Partially for the wrong reasons, obviously, the fact that we see the CO2 emissions increasing. But I think society in many societies have actually adopted this, and of course are beginning to understand it and beginning to see it in the media and beginning to join the dots and beginning to see it impacts both them and future generations. And of course that then drives politics, but it also drives markets. So for me, that is just sort of the critical reason why I think I've got some optimism. I think perhaps on the sort of the more corporate side, and Maria, you've touched on it, I think it is sort of expected that we do have within value chain collaboration and I think that it's obviously there anyway on one base to sort of flex the basis to expand it to incorporate climate change. But I think we're also seeing huge interest in collaborating, swapping stories, investing together cross value chain as well, as we think to do invest in some of the technologies which are slightly out of reach at the moment, which we might have to deploy in order to be net zero and not neutral. So we're seeing, cross businesses collaborating in all sorts of different initiatives. There may be a requirement for consolidation. There's so many at the moment, but some of them feel really powerful and exciting and new, and focused on innovating around the sort of the shared challenge that people face. So I think I just sort of point to those two things, I think, which gives me cause for optimism.
Thank you, Sam. Miguel, final thoughts?
Thanks. Yes, in terms of hope, one of the main things for me, I think, is that in spite of the current pandemic, the interest and the push on climate action, I don't think it has diminished. You can see, well, Maria Paola mentioned the EU Green Deal. It was agreed in the middle of this situation. And well, the US has turned the political direction. There has been so much interest in this topic, even in the middle of the most difficult moments of COVID. In many other times, I think you could easily have seen and with some reason, of course, I mean, it's understandable. You could have seen some governments and local authorities and companies saying, oh no, we're in the middle of a pandemic. This is hurting our bottom line. This is hurting our economies, etc. Priority is economic recovery, and we think about climate a bit later, like we have done before. But this time, I think it has been different. We do realize that we're in a troublesome position economically, but since we are understanding or starting to understand that if we don't do something about climate later on, it will be much worse. So we cannot use the excuse or the reason of COVID to postpone even more things that we should have been doing already for decades now. So it gives me a lot of hope to see that in spite of this situation, the focus on climate has not been lost.
Thank you, Miguel. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Michelle right now, who has been fielding some questions from our guest today. Michelle?
Thank you, Amy. One of the questions that came up in the chat that I think Miguel partially addressed, I just want to open it up to the rest of the panelists, is that the questioner is wondering about the difference between how multinational companies are sort of involved in the COP, and although COP is really meant for country negotiations, what role do companies have to play at the COP, and how can multinational companies navigate their choices based on the varying country-specific regulations that are happening around the world?
Well, if I may just say something, I think companies, corporations must be involved in the negotiations because they are the greatest polluters. So we cannot make any negotiation if they don't agree to this. It doesn't mean that the negotiation should should make life easier for corporations at all, but it should be the way that we find, that the negotiators find, should be something that the companies can effectively implement as soon as possible. So this is the reason why we think that corporations should be present at the negotiation table. I don't know, Sam, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess Miguel, UNFCCC, you're the expert of what actually happens at COP. I guess just a couple of observations from my side. One would be, I think there is a huge interest of business in this COP, and it seems like UNFCCC plus ICC plus Race to Zero, etc., are really galvanizing that interest, which I think is great. So businesses are learning, but they're also looking forward to this being a point in time for their own commitments, targets, etc. So I think that's really important. It's the particular question. It's not the issue about sort of nations versus multinationals. It is tricky, and I guess I think Maria, maybe you said it earlier, or maybe you, Miguel. But the hope obviously is COP26 is creating a greater level of standardization, homogenization around the policies adopted by countries. If that is the case, then of course there's a greater read over to multinationals. But I think certainly multinationals have a huge opportunity to actually be more progressive and indeed an obligation to be more progressive in perhaps countries which are less progressive. And so I think there's a sort of joint onus on delivering some of the principles that the COP26 is really trying to drive.
See, maybe from my side, I try to respond a little bit in the chat, so you can look at that, the participants. But yes, indeed, when we talk about negotiations, strictly, it's about national governments, right? The negotiations under the UNFCCC, it's national governments only. However, organizations like companies and others, they do have a voice through a process that is called observers. So they have spaces open to them to make statements, to provide feedback. They can also submit inputs to the negotiations before the sessions when there is a request from national governments. So these are the elements through which companies can participate officially in the negotiation. But then beyond that, there is more and more emphasis in interacting with companies and other stakeholders in society, especially since the Paris Agreement was adopted. So you have the figures of the high-level global climate action champions. Again, right now, a representative from the UK and another one from Chile, which have the mandate to do exactly that, engage with everyone who is not a national government. And through them, through different collaborations that they lead and that we support from the Secretariat, like the Race to Zero, like the Marrakesh Partnership, which is where ICC is, Sam, and also many other organizations, ICLE for subnational governments and many others. Through that, they are trying to create more bridges between the negotiations, formal negotiations, and everybody else, so that the inputs from both sides flow to each other, right? And we hopefully help facilitate what Maria was suggesting, that governments make the decision knowing what is the position and what are the needs of everybody else in society. And everybody else in society, of course, knows how governments want to address this issue and try to, as Sam was saying, get ahead of the curve even, right? Governments take time to implement policies. The EU Green Deal was not an easy thing to do, right? The fund for the support fund for COVID-19 has not yet been agreed just this week. So it takes time, and sometimes corporations or companies can be even faster in responding. And as Sam was saying, you also have the pressure from your customer, probably from partners in business, etc. So there is probably no complete need for companies to be at the table, at the negotiation table itself. Yes, to have their voice heard, to provide inputs, to encourage, etc. But sometimes they can even get ahead of national governments in responding to this, right? Which is what we're seeing in some cases. Like Kiesa, I guess.
Thank you all for that input. I think we have time for one more question for the panelists. And I want to bring it back to the conversation between Maria and Miguel about the definitions of carbon neutrality versus net zero. And we're wondering that it seems there is a bit of a lack of consensus on the appropriate terminology or definitions for setting and communicating targets, whether that be carbon or climate neutral or net zero or climate positive. So wondering if all three of you, if this lack of consensus on terminology, if you found that this is an issue that we collectively need to understand and to advance our carbon zero goals.
Well, I'll be very quick. From my perspective, I think that this lack of consensus on terminology reflects that there is no common policy, a common standard. And so we have no common terminology. So it's very important to address that this issue of having common standards and common protocols.
Yeah, I would second that. It's, definitions, it's taxonomy, it's measures, it's metrics, and we are making progress. And I think things like I think it was a blog from HSBC earlier about TCFD, sort of saying it builds muscle. So it doesn't deliver the answer, but it builds sort of muscle tissue, or maybe muscle's not a tissue, builds muscle initially, and then we can start to layer on the specificity around metrics and targets and consistency after that. So I think this, it's a journey, as everybody always says, but we've got to compress it. We've really got to move fast, because I think it is a bit of a barrier. It does create a bit of a challenge. I think the other thing that Miguel, the key difference I guess you're touching upon really is trying to bring that offsetting, if you like, to make it to make the organization accountable for the person who's setting the target. I mean, I guess that's the essence of what you're trying to do with that change in definition or that movement. And so I very much like the idea that so first of all, efficiency-wise, if you did have a sort of rich offset market, you did everything you could, you were acting in good faith, and you had a really efficient, auditable offset market, then to me that, in the interim, that might not be a bad thing. I do, however, like the concept, which is perhaps sits somewhere in between, where that you do something very close to home. So, if that can be sitting in, the country you're in, or the town you're in, or the supply chain you're in, then that's better than having a transaction with a third-party organization into some sort of scheme or initiative somewhere else, which might be excellent, but is completely different, completely outside of your scope of interest, knowledge, and engagement. So I think that sort of bringing it closer to home is really, really good. I wonder whether you have to actually make it as far as you say and bring it right onto your doorstep or into your house.
Thanks. No, and from my side, just to say that, yes, indeed, there is no consensus yet about the definitions, but this is normal because it's relatively new concepts, right? So it takes time for experts and for the community to agree. As I mentioned, ISO is working on a new standard, 14068 for carbon neutrality. And the idea is, or the hope is that standard will also propose some definitions for all of this, so that everybody can understand exactly what we're talking about when we say carbon neutral, climate neutral, net zero, climate positive, climate negative, whatever it is. IPCC has also been looking at this, and if you have seen, they refer to net zero at global level, right? Only at global level. They don't address it at organization level. And they have also been making a distinction between carbon neutral and GHG neutral, meaning all other GHGs included, not only CO2. But again, this is still an ongoing process. It should not be a barrier to taking action, as Sam was saying. We can discuss, we can standardize as much as possible. It's not only the terminology or the taxonomy as well, it's also the access to data. It has been a challenge at a governmental level. Now it's going down, right, to more detailed levels. But that should not stop action, right? The fact that we are not able to agree 100% on terminology or taxonomies, but it will help, of course, once we have either the ISO or some other guidance that is accepted as the global guidance.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I think at this point, we're nearing the end, so I'll pass it back to Amy to wrap up and begin the discussion about our carbon neutrality database.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I want to thank Sam, Maria, and Miguel for joining us today. Really appreciate your input and insightfulness. I have a lot more questions, but we'll have a whole nother year to get together again and perhaps chat about this more and hear about how these initiatives are going. So thank you all. And I'm turning it back to Alex now. Alex?
Thank you so much, and thank you to our esteemed panelists for such an insightful discussion. Let me switch gears here. Great. So it is clear from our discussion today and from what we're seeing happen globally that the climate crisis cannot be tackled in silos, and to accelerate action, collaboration is critical. The scale of cumulative connected change across sectors and regions that is needed to achieve the 1.5 degree goal laid out in the Paris Agreement requires a systemic transformation. And to see real change in systems, we need to remove barriers to the flow of transformation that can support ambitious decision-making, enabling organizations to build capacity and also to better inform and empower the public. And as we heard, improved transparency, tracking, and consistency of net zero and carbon neutral targets is really critical for constructive progress and actually moving the needle forward. And as mentioned by our panelists as well, there are many opportunities to accelerate the global race to zero. And we hope that the Carbon Neutrality Database initiative can also help support diverse climate actors to set and achieve their net zero goals. And that the database can help ensure that ambitious commitments are translated into action. So I'm now looking forward to telling you a little bit more about Climate Registry and our Carbon Neutrality Database project. So first, to give you a brief overview of the work we do at the Climate Registry. Up here on the screen are our 4 pillars. A major focus area of our work is to build capacity in greenhouse gas management, reporting, and verification for organizations across diverse sectors. We also provide additional support for climate action and ambition by developing and contributing to innovative new tools and initiatives. We also support organizations who are leading the way by showcasing their climate leadership and providing opportunities for recognition and incentivizing excellence in GHG reporting and reductions. Provide a little more context on some of these relevant topic areas in terms of building capacity in GHG measurement, reporting, verification. We author and publish best practice GHG reporting protocols. We develop these protocols through multi-stakeholder consensus-based processes, which we do to ensure the standards we develop are accurate and helpful to our stakeholders. In just looking at the time here, I guess we could skip along to more about the database itself. But just another important aspect of our work at the Climate Registry is developing and contributing to innovative tools and programs to support more climate action and ratchet up ambition. And given our position as a standard setter and thought leader in the GHG measurement, reporting, verification, we've heard from many stakeholders that there are quite a few areas that need to be addressed in the net zero and carbon neutral space in order to better support the diverse organizations that we work with in the race to zero. And although the path to net zero may be complex, that isn't stopping businesses, governments, and organizations from pursuing this ambitious and important goal. And given the variety of actors setting net zero targets, as we've heard, no single approach or standard for net zero targets would be appropriate or effective. But there are also a number of networks and initiatives across the climate community that define the substantive criteria that businesses, cities, states, investors, and others setting carbon neutral and net zero targets are required to meet. So with consideration to the array of efforts happening worldwide, we've heard there's consensus that improved cross-sector collaboration, increased transparency, and continued investment and advocacy in progressing the technology and policy that we need to achieve these ambitious goals are necessary. And we've also heard that greater alignment around common principles to underlie the diversity of approaches we see would be helpful. So given all of that, we hope that the Carbon Neutrality Database will address the following needs listed here on the screen. But really our goal for the database is that it will serve as a one-stop shop for information about carbon neutral commitments, pathways, achievements, research, guidance across all sectors. So not only will the database help organizations looking to set a carbon neutral and net zero goal, but it will also help those with existing commitments to enhance or expand their pathways with more robust and rigorous actions and goals. And of course, we'd like to empower the public to better understand the different types of commitments in the climate action space as well. Let's take a look here. And as far as what we envision the database to be, it'll be a public web-based tool that can be easily navigated by multiple audiences, from the general public, to policymakers, corporations, researchers, and our goal is for all users to be able to access the tool easily and find the information that they need. And so to ensure the database is accurate and relevant for actors across different sectors and regions, we're using the same consensus-based multi-stakeholder process that we do for our protocols to develop the framework for the database. And within the framework, we hope to establish a common language on what it means to be carbon neutral or net zero and bring together as many examples of successful pathways and innovative approaches to overcoming the challenges on the road to zero. And I am cognizant that we are at time now, so to give you just a little quick insight into the two very impressive stakeholder groups that we put together, our working group and advisory committee, which we are very happy to include two of our panelists from today, Deloitte and UNFCCC on. And again, we have put together these groups to really ensure that the database is helpful, relevant, and accurate for the wide variety of users that we hope will be able to access it and use it. And also, last but not least, we would like to thank our sponsors for helping us launch this project. We are pleased to have great support from IBM, Cliff Family Foundation, Enlist Fund, and C2ES. So thanks very much to them for helping to make this project a reality. And with that, I know we are at time, but if there are any questions about the Carbon Neutrality Database project, please let me know. And I will also include a link in the chat now if you'd like to find
Thank you, Alex. There are no questions about the Carbon Neutrality Database in the chat. So I think we can wrap up.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. We'd love for you to stay connected with us as this project progresses. So please do check our website, just include it in the chat, and it's up here on the slide as well. And you can subscribe for updates on the database. And if you have any questions or would like more information on the project, feel free to contact me. My email is also listed here on the slide. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of London Climate Action Week, and we look forward to staying in touch on this important and exciting initiative as we continue to build momentum for its COP26. So thank you all very much.